friend, a frequent guest, comrade. We're here with Eskandar Sadeghi. Eskandar is a specialist and expert in Iran and Iranian history. He is a professor at the University of St. Andrews School of International Relations, author of Revolution and Its Discontents, Political Thought and Reform in Iran, frequent contributor to fancy journals like the New Left Review and the London Review of Books. Frequently, recently especially, been a guest on all kinds of podcasts and radio shows and doing interviews, which is really cool because like so many of the interviews I see are with really kind of the establishment people. So I'm really glad that you're getting stuff as well as anybody, and you're telling them different version than like we're usually getting in the mainstream press. So really thanks again for chatting
Anytime,
with me.
anytime for you, Bob.
I think the
Great
last
to see
time we
you.
spoke was about a year ago, when the U.S. attacked Iran, and so I think we'll just like to start by with a little bit of kind of an update from then to now. That was a sustained attack. Trump at that time claimed he obliterated Iran's nuclear programs, and that was the kind of basis for it. That was the stated public reason, right? We're going to get rid of Iran's nuclear program, right? This is after Trump had abandoned the joint agreement on Iranian nuclear program that had been signed under Obama. So anyway, since then, for a time, we didn't really talk about Iran much, but then in the last few months, it's kind of erupted once more into kind of as a news item. A lot of that has to do with the protests in Iran. We still hear about the nuclear program, but do you want to just kind of talk about the aftermath of last summer's attack and how that led to where we are today?
Sure. So I mean, obviously in the June, well, that was known now as the 12-day war. Israel obviously launched a unprovoked attack called Operation Rising Lion, and in the sort of the first hours, assassinated many senior kind of commanders in the Revolutionary Guards. They even attempted to assassinate one of the lead negotiators, who very sort of, I mean, fortunately, he survived. Um, and this was obviously, they attacked like the days before Iran was supposed to meet with the United States, I guess Steve Witkoff in particular in Oman, in order to continue negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program. And I think like reporting since then, I mean, like in places like the Washington Post, like mainstream venues, makes it very, very clear that this was, as I said at the time, so I feel vindicated, was coordinated, and was basically in many ways a ruse in order to catch Iran off guard. Um, and yeah, obviously they availed themselves of, like really cutting edge, like military technology, in order to kind of, in order to target, not only kind of the elite brass, to the top brass of the Iranian military, but I mean, even those very close to assassinating the prime minister. And then I'm sure you saw there was also basically messages that were sent, or phone leading figures within the Iranian state were called up and pretty much like threatened that they and their entire families would be killed if they didn't like record a video defecting. And this obviously didn't have an impact ultimately. But yeah, undeniably, I mean, this was very, it was very, very impactful attack. I don't think there's much doubt at this point that obviously the Israelis had considerable aerial like superiority. Nevertheless, obviously Iran was able to, launch a significant number of missiles and able to penetrate the Iron Dome defense system. And I mean, I think it's correct, and this has been confirmed, I guess, by people who are in the Trump orbit, that the Israelis basically pretty much asked for for a ceasefire, simply because they were unable to unable to kind of repel these missile attacks from Iran. And obviously Iran was then committed to to inflicting a quite serious cost, which I don't think Israel had previously really kind of experienced. So they hit like the Weizmann Institute and a number of kind of high profile targets, even though the number of casualties wasn't very high. I think it was like about 30 or so. But in Iran, it was about 1,000 or more people were ultimately killed. And then, I mean, long story short, I mean, since June, what we've seen is kind of increased sort of pressure on the part of the Trump administration. Obviously, we've seen Benjamin Netanyahu go back and forth multiple times to Washington more than any other foreign leader. Like I think what this is 7 times since January. Um, and clearly, again, coordinating, applying pressure, lobbying for a certain outcome. And I guess more aggression, more sort of a far more severe and aggressive stance and posture with respect to the Islamic Republic. So, I mean, that's what we've been seeing. And then obviously within Iran itself, the economic situation has been in many ways, perilous and has been worsening. And this is obviously the culmination of, 14 years of sanctions. Obviously, with that brief respite, that brief like reprieve following the 2018 JCPOA, and even then, I mean, that agreement had its issues. It was sort of, but it was like a basis on which to build. But yeah, so Iran has basically been facing economic warfare and strangulation I mean, in a very severe way. I mean, since 2012. I mean, obviously, there's always been arms embargoes and these sorts of things and freezing of assets, etc. Um, but yeah, it's really, really intensified 2012, and what we've seen is like the accumulation of this kind of corrosive effect of sanctions on the kind of domestic political economy inside Iran, and that's when we saw obviously these late December these protests begin in relation to the 40% depreciation in the currency um, since the June war. And a lot of this has to do with the structural weaknesses within the Iranian economy, as well as, I'm sure, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, also probably, who's made his money through currency manipulation, may well have also played a role in kind of pushing Iran further over like the precipice, basically. Um, and then anyway, these protests, in between the 8th and 9th of January, basically really intensified, in part maybe in response to a certain call from Reza Pahlavi, sort of the son of the late Shah. And then there were kind of these very, very significant protests over these 2 days, and then these were obviously very severely and brutally repressed by the state, in which several thousand people. The state claims about just above 3,000. Other human rights organizations are claiming 7,000 so far. Yeah, and the reality is, I mean, yeah, it does seem there's probably in the figures around the several thousand, and and this is where we are currently. I don't know if you want to kind of open up sort of
Yeah,
the best further or not. Yeah.
were the kind of more recent round of protests, were those kind of initially prompted by the conditions you mentioned, shortages, inflation, crumbling infrastructure, corruption? I mean, was it initially kind of this kind of like a fundamental, or because the U.S. media tends to say it was about like freedom and liberty and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And
I
also,
mean,
while you're doing it, mention the role of Reza Pahlavi because I know you've written about that as well.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so I mean, it's a complex one because on the one hand, what kind of process we saw depended sort of very much regionally. There was a lot of differences. So, like in Tehran, you could say that there were people there who were definitely experiencing maybe socio-economic grievances, but there are a lot of people who are very profoundly disgruntled with the Islamic Republic and want to see it gone, who went in there, who participated in these protests. Somewhere like Loristan, I mean, yeah, someone might like, which again might very much dislike the Islamic Republic, but there was certainly this question of economic survival. It has the highest rates of unemployment. There's severe like rural and sort of provincial poverty, which has massively increased. Again, in part due to sanctions and in part due to kind of like corruption and mismanagement and all these sorts of things. So really what we're seeing is like in those protests, what we see really the coming together of obviously political grievances, social grievances, and also profoundly like socioeconomic ones and class-driven ones, like insofar as I mean, like I was mentioning this to you before we kind of started recording, and what we need to kind of understand is how obviously on the one hand we have economic warfare and sort of economic siege, which is very, very real, targeting Iran's oil revenues. You have secondary sanctions. So basically even a third country can't invest in Iran. They're going to, because they're going to basically be hit with insane fines by the Treasury. And basically they're told, either you can trade with the United States or you can trade with Iran. And obviously, they're going to choose the United States and also, cut off from key payment systems like the SWIFT system. So it's like basically impossible to kind of conduct like just basic economic like activity and like trade and things like this, um, which are then which basically on the other hand deepens like when it increases and intensifies like inequality, and this is like depends regionally, and it's really kind of vary across the country. Um, and at the same time, it kind of deepens kind of these certain kind of like clientelistic sort of networks, which are so people who are kind of close to the state, who have access to favored rates of currency, right? Or they basically have access to smuggling networks and things like this. They're obviously going to be massively empowered. They know how to navigate the system, and they're close to political power, and they know how to use that in order to advance their own kind of interest. But obviously, that's going to be, to the disadvantage of working class people overwhelmingly, the majority of the population. And then this is the thing, like sanctions are designed to do this. I mean, we don't need to, the architects of the empire are very frank and like open about it. They say, we are doing this, and we've designed this policy in order to impoverish the population so they will then, rise up and will apply pressure to the state. I mean, this is what they're meant to do. I mean, if anyone has any doubts about this, I actually suggest they read, it's really a kind of a horrendous book, but Richard Nephew, who was previously in the State Department, is also in the National Security Advisor under Obama. He wrote a book called The Art of Sanctions, and he literally is like documenting in granular detail, like all of the measures that they took, how they designed sanctions policy in order to create maximum pain.
Yeah.
Like to the extent that like they even targeted, for instance, like chicken prices, the price of chicken and poultry around key Iranian holidays to create, and like it says it like in black and white. I've actually got a piece which I'm like, we should be coming out. With Phenomenal World at some point, which is kind of documents a lot of this in more sort of detail. But yeah, so just to not go on for too long, but like, I mean, these protests were clearly, they're organic, they're a product of real like socioeconomic and political discontent, and the fact that people just, they see the state as dysfunctional and not working for them and as corrupt, and obviously they don't necessarily see the role that sanctions have played in bringing them to this point. I mean, that's the kind of the really pernicious thing about sanctions. Basically, they sort of they're invisible. They're not like bombs, and but we know that like even from the First World War, like actually like it was kind of the economic blockades which were far more deadly and killed way more people than either gas or like aerial bombardment. I mean, they're truly deadly. So no, so just so I would say it's a mixture of both, right? And really, what we see, these sanctions have intensified class inequality, economic inequality profoundly. And then the ruling class within Iran has kind of obviously, some have benefited from sanctions, others maybe not so. But overwhelmingly, the burden has been shifted onto working people and like and the middle class, and that's why they're so angry. So that kind of explains the absolute like anti-systemic like rage at the system as a whole.
Well, you mentioned they're kind of candid about what they're doing. We see this in Cuba right now, where like Trump just, he kind of says what's on his mind, and clearly there's no hiding that what they're trying to do is starve Cuba out and either
Yeah, yeah,
kill a million people or hope that they overthrow the government or whatever. So
yeah,
you
yeah.
mentioned, and I don't like getting into conspiracy theory, but on this one, it's really prevalent here in the West, or at least in the US, right? Because you mentioned the organic nature of it, and you have a lot of people who are defending the Iranian regime and claiming that this is all, a Mossad operation and so on. And I think you've been caught up in that. You've had people criticize you, right? uh,
Yeah,
I suspect there's probably white Westerners who've never been anywhere near Iran,
yeah, it is.
or Australian pseudo lefty scholars, um, Diane Johnstone. But if you want to talk about like just kind of, I know you just mentioned it, but just kind of to kind of reiterate, like the organic nature of this. Like, are there like I know a few years ago there was like a lot of protests by women, right? And then I think there was another round. Are these kind of just spontaneous people going to the streets? Are there groups, community groups or civil groups who are kind of organizing them, workers groups, anything like that?
Like
How
I
do
said,
they actually take
yeah.
place?
So I mean, there is lots of there's like worker organizing, there's like women's organizing, there are like various Kurdish groups, for instance, in civil
Hmm.
society and Baluch, those who are kind of, I guess, um, because obviously Iran is, comprised of not just obviously the Persian speaking majority, or perhaps not even a majority, but like Bob, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, you
Sorry,
cut you
man.
off. Yeah.
Yeah.
No worries, no worries. So there is
Okay.
like an active. So I just wasn't sure if I was cut off. No. So yeah, no, there clearly are like groups representing different issues and constituencies, right, in civil society in Iran, and they are very kind of active. And like it could be everything from like oil workers and gas workers, people working like in the oil refineries, through to like retirees and things like this, and teachers. I mean, teachers organizing. There was a massive sort of national protest by teachers, which was like incredible, actually. So there's lots of these sort of protests, which are kind of like quite frequent in Iran, actually. But then these big protests, which basically spiral and become nationwide, I think they are largely spontaneous insofar as I mean, again, it's like where does the organizing, where does the spontaneity, where do the two meet? But I mean, when I'm saying spontaneous, I mean no one's sort of planning to sort of launch this nationwide protest, which basically encompasses 100 cities, and towns, and even small towns with like populations of 20,000 people. Um, so no, I mean, so the big ones, I guess, were 2017, 2018, which again was very much linked to, I would say, yeah, political grievances, socioeconomic pain, etc., which has been increasing and intensifying, and increased sort of anger at, yeah, just broad injustice, I would say, that was prevalent. Then in 2022, there was the Woman Life Freedom protest, which again was sparked by this young woman who was killed in custody, or died in custody, who was killed in custody. Um, and that was obviously led predominantly by women, but even that was very much like a coalescence of a lot of kind of regional discontent around, like, again, socioeconomic questions, as well as questions around ethnic kind of oppression in Iran. So in places like Baluchistan and Kurdistan, because they tend to be in border regions, they often don't really get the spoils of, like, they haven't enjoyed like the dividends of development really, and they tend to be really kind of underdevelopment. And many of them were actually, for instance, I mean, in Kurdistan, but also in the south west, for instance, where Iraq actually initially invaded Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. These regions, like in a sense, they were never fully. Some of them were never fully really rebuilt, like after the war. So they're really quite deprived. They have terrible infrastructure, and in a sense, like I said, the dividends of development. And this is like not just a approach of policy. It's also because like anywhere, resources get sort of pulled into the capital and like the major cities. So they eat up and gobble up a lot of the resources and a lot of the wealth, and then obviously naturally, and that obviously then creates this cascading effect where you have more and more intensified kind of province to sort of capital kind of, or like, or less developed areas and border regions, and then migration to the cities. So, it's a problem, not just political and policy one. It's like also like a developmental one, and how development has actually been enacted in kind of Iran. But so yeah, so you have like these nationwide protests, these two massive nationwide protests in 2017, 2018, and then 2022. And then, yeah, this is kind of another, and then you had also a major protest in 2019, which wasn't quite nationwide, but it was very significant because what happened is the Rouhani government in 2019, they basically removed subsidies off petroleum, which then acted as like a regressive tax on like working class people who obviously really rely on it. And you can imagine like peddlers or guys on motorbikes who deliver things, or taxi services and things like this. They're like really, it hits them. It's like VAT, right? It like hits like working class people much harder. And that was another thing which sparked a major kind of protest, and that was quite brutally repressed. So, but this latest one, yeah, I think it's sort of all of these in many ways coming together. And so there was like initially protests in the bazaar, and then again, which acted as like a trigger. And then that's what sort of leads it to spreading, really countrywide, like like over 100 like cities and towns, and that's not something which one can engineer. I mean, I think the question is like, this is organic, it's real, and it's rooted in genuine forms of like class oppression, like the ethnic question in Iran, which is still hasn't been resolved, gender oppression. I mean, these are all real things, right? And it's rooted in that, but it's the question like, how then has this been catalyzed in many ways and exacerbated by kind of US policy? And then how does like the US and Israel seek to kind of like insinuate themselves and take advantage of it, right, to create like maximum destabilization? Like, so they can both be kind of true, right? There clearly is like collusion between the US and Israel in order to try to take advantage of this and destabilize it, and smuggling in Starlink and all these sorts of things. Obviously, they claim that it's because they care about Iranians' freedom, which is of course like absurd. Um, but yeah, we also really, and the reality of it is, I mean, I have seen footage of people with rifles, clearly organized, with guns, armed as well, like who aren't from the state. So the degree of like violence, I mean, the fact that, I mean, obviously we have the catastrophe of a state which has killed thousands of its own citizens, which that I think has to be like moral responsibility needs to be placed there, and they need to be held accountable for that, and the people who ordered it and were, chiefly responsible, they need to be held accountable, because that's a crime. It's a horrendous crime of humanity, against its own people. Um, but at the same time, there clearly are like elements who sought to exacerbate, intensify this. And we know this because like hundreds of security officials were killed, like as well. Like, and some of them were like parts of the Basij militia, some of them were just people who were trying to defend mosques, things like this. So and the reality is really we don't have a full picture, and we might never have one. I think that's the important thing, because even quite like high profile like reformist figures inside Iran, they were even alleging that a lot of this was agents provocateurs by the state, which like again one has to be super careful. I think like we really don't know to what extent maybe the state was doing this to exacerbate so they can more quickly repress it, to what extent the Israelis, because we know the Israelis had assets on the ground as well. I mean, and I'm sure the CIA does as well, because obviously what they did in the June War, I mean, how they quickly, they used drones and other means to take out Iranian rocket launchers in order to sort of carry out assassinations. So again, it's a very difficult picture, and I guess like the problem is like conspiracy theory offers us like a really simplistic kind of like answer, say, oh, it's all down to this or it's all down to that, and the reality is that we have like multiple kind of social forces and agents really, and political actors who are kind of very much battling things out in a complex kind of political economic structure, both domestically and then internationally. And like a lot of people don't want to grapple with that. They just want the easy kind of answer.
We're seeing that here with Venezuela. It's pretty clear they were collaborators
Yeah.
in Caracas when the U.S. came in. Is the leadership invoking kind of Israel and the United States as a way to kind of rally people? I mean, if I remember kind of going back to Saddam. We talked about that earlier too. Like Saddam was not a popular leader. He really was a repressive dictator, right? But it seemed that like he was able to invoke the United States to maintain some level of support. Are the Iranian government doing that, saying, "Hey, this is outsiders are coming in, and we need to join together"? Because I assume even among people who don't support the regime, there's this level of nationalism, like, yeah, we don't like you, we'd like to get rid of you, but we don't want outsiders coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we did see like that happening in the 12-day war. So I mean, people didn't like rise up to, to stage or try to overthrow the government. And they obviously saw what the Israelis did. I mean, the Israelis like bombed famously like Evin prison, and they killed like 70 people, including like social workers and people visiting their relatives. I mean, I think a lot of people do see through that. Um, and I think most people do. And even if they don't like the Islamic Republic, they're very skeptical about like the US being able to kind of like liberate them, quote unquote. So there is that. But there is this other thing which is a bit like uncomfortable, and I struggle with it insofar as there is also quite amongst certain people, and again, one can't shouldn't generalize. There, and I should say actually, so the government does have like a strong base of support, right? Which, and again, one has to always caveat this because obviously they channel huge amounts of resources into mobilizing these people and so on and so forth. But there are people who are genuinely kind of invested in the Islamic Republic, right? And they come out like when there's rallies and again, there's like there is incentives in some instances, but there are people who are also genuinely committed. But there are people who like, and it's quite widespread. I've seen this belief that like they do believe that the Israelis were just like targeting the state and they're not actually going to kill like ordinary Iranians. They're like there are people who think this like, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's especially small. Like there is like there are some people who do think this, and they do think that because whatever they're so disgruntled and they're so like outraged by their current circumstances, and there's just like this like pervasive like I don't know. I think it's kind of like nihilism really. Um, that they and just like apathy that they think like yeah like the US could carry out a targeted strike and it's going to actually help bring like democracy. There are some people who do think this and they are in Iran, like they're not just in like the diaspora. um, so there are people who do think this. I mean the question is like they might think this but then will they actually do anything in terms of like to act on it? And I think most people know, right? Like they're not. I mean, they're going to weigh the balance of forces and they're going to see, okay, no, the Islamic Republic is still standing strong at this point. So we just have to tolerate it, and they'll vent and they'll scream, to their relatives or, with the taxi driver, but it doesn't necessarily have a political, like, it doesn't cash out in like political praxis in any kind of meaningful kind of sense, right? And then, yeah, but I do think that the majority of people obviously are just very fearful. I mean, the majority are kind of they don't like the Islamic Republic. They also just see that the Islamic Republic is currently it has this like real crisis of just governance. It just can't solve any of the major problems, whether it's about air pollution, whether it's about water scarcity and water insecurity, whether it's about like just inflation and just economic like deterioration. Um, so there's lots of people like that, but they also are kind of trapped, right? They understand like that an Israeli bombing campaign is not going to solve things. If anything, it could make things far, far worse. But like Iran is kind of stuck, is like in this impasse, which is, but I think it's largely by design because the United States really isn't interested in like negotiations that would actually then lead to sanctions relief that would then obviously improve the economic situation. And unfortunately, we're still in this situation. We're not like, despite people talking a lot about multipolarity, the financial system, the global financial system is still absolutely dominated by the United States. Um, and that's just an undeniable fact. And like, if anything, the sanctions have forced Iran to become extremely far more dependent on China, so that like 90% of its oil, 90% of its oil and gas goes to China. And the United States kind of has an agreement with China, and yeah, it can't force China to basically stop buying oil from Iran, but it does make Iran's situation very precarious. And and buying, being able to sell oil to China at a discounted rate isn't going to alleviate the deep problems in Iran's economy. I mean, it's just not, right? So this is the kind of, I mean, again, it's a complex picture. I think Iran is extremely polarized. Like it's like insanely polarized to the point where, like in the universities, protests have started again. I mean, just while like very intense ones. Just while, the USS Abraham Lincoln and then the Gerald R. Ford are basically coming, is now coming to the Persian Gulf to basically engage in gunboat like diplomacy, gunboat extortion is probably a better kind of term for it. And like these like intense protests, I mean, some instances they were kind of shouting pro like Pahlavi slogans, which is kind of which is really shocking and disconcerting because like the university was always in Iran as well, just like it is in many places. It was usually the site of much more radical like political kind of energy. So that was one thing. And also they were even like scenes of them burning the flag, the national flag, and then basically tearing down pictures of those killed in the June War. So I think like there's just a profound sense of like alienation where many people just anything associated with the state, they kind of really repudiate it actually. So even amongst like nationalists, they will repudiate the Islamic Republic, but because they're very worried about the question of like the balkanization of Iran potentially, if there was an invasion and then or like a bombing campaign and then some sort of civil war broke out, so they still managed to hold on to this idea of territorial integrity, and this is something which must be preserved at all cost. But that's something which has kind of been almost like it's been like kind of used for a long time, both by the state in order to kind of suppress like free discussion of lots of things and actually like a change in policy. So again, it's like I think, like I said, what we really see is a profoundly polarized society, actually. Um, And in the case of a war, yeah, I don't think people are going to be running out and like supporting. The majority won't be going out and supporting the bombing campaign, but you probably will have like organized groups on the ground, whether Israeli linked or not. I don't know. Like they could just be people who hate the Islamic Republic, trying to organize to take advantage of the situation. I mean, that's totally possible as well. So yeah, it's pretty precarious.
You mentioned the diaspora and you dropped Reza
Uh,
Pahlavi's name a couple times. To be honest with you, like until like 2 years ago, I didn't know he was still alive. So, I mean, talking about like coming out of nowhere, right? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and I read something. I don't think you wrote it, but maybe you did. Because I know you've written about Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
essentially, what I've read, the consensus is that the Iranis would never tolerate these kind of, especially these American Iranians coming in and taking over, like no matter what legitimate grievances they may have with the current regime. I mean, do you sense that there will be kind of a unifying, against that?
The problem again, Rob, is like I think like Iran is probably like one of the most like propagandized places in the world. I guess it's like maybe like Cuba in that regard. But so I mean, like, it does seem that, like, there are some people, and like reasonable people who I used to like consider reasonable, who are increasingly kind of the opinion that he is like the only alternative to the Islamic Republic, which is, and obviously this itself is like the product of like, like 15 years of just like intense propaganda by kind of foreign-backed like news channels in Iran that had been peddling this idea that the Pahlavi era was some kind of golden age and everybody was really wealthy and affluent and everything was like fantastic and Iran was like respected. Like you wouldn't like if you watch these channels, like you wouldn't even know that like there was a revolution or why there was a revolution in
This
Iran in the
this
first
is
place.
in Iran.
No, no, no. These are
Oh,
all in London,
no,
actually. Like for
because
the
no,
most
I've
part.
heard people in LA Iranians say that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But
Okay, I
you
was gonna
you
say,
will.
whoa.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, you get a lot of that. You get a lot
Yeah.
of that type. But I do think like it has affected people. One is because like the kind of lack of trust and like in many ways like I guess bankruptcy of like state television in Iran. So then that in a sense has been filled. That vacuum has been then filled by these like news channels, like propaganda stations, basically, um, which have then spun this really kind of crazy narrative. And don't get me wrong, there's like a lot of people who think this is absolutely nonsensical and obviously think this is ridiculous. But there are, I would say, that compared to maybe like several years ago, there has been like an uptick in kind of like support. So like in support for like Pahlavi and like the return of the monarchy. But it's like relative. But so for instance, like in a lot of those protests, the ones that I was talking about, they were like really brutally repressed. Like, again, a lot of people were talking about freedom. A lot of people were talking about death to the dictator. A lot of people these were like a lot of the slogans, right? But there were like slogans as well, sort of saying like, this is like one that was particularly pronounced was like, this is the last battle, Pahlavi will return. That was like a kind of a common one. And that was even said again in some of these university protests, which are kind of like ongoing. So there is like some of that, but I mean, the way I understand Pahlavi is that he's essentially like a kind of a scarecrow to just batter again, to be used against the Islamic Republic by the Israelis.
Yeah, he is a Zionist.
Yeah, well, no, he went to Israel.
Yeah, yeah.
He met Netanyahu. He's being backed by the Israeli information ministry.
Yeah.
They're promoting him. They're boosting him. They're on X, on all these sort of social platforms. They're massively kind of promoting him. But it does seem like he does have an increased following in Iran now, for those reasons that I said, like the desperation, the sort of, and also, I mean, the Islamic Republic has kind of systematically, this needs to be said, the Islamic Republic has kind of systematically, obviously, repressed and like disorganized and circumscribed like domestic channels, so forces that have tried to challenged the Islamic Republic or called for reform. I mean, it's marginalized all of these. So I mean, which to be honest, is a lot of regimes of this kind of do. They want to create like extremities. So it's like, okay, it's either us or it's that. It's a bit like what like Assad did when he kind of released Islamist prisoners and things like that, and sort of made it this choice between it's either us or it's like ISIS, and that's your only option. So you basically destroy anything in between, right? Um, and because and both sides, both extremities are invested in that policy. So just like the monarchists are like, very much invested in destroying, and so anybody, any kind of internal opposition figure is somehow complicit or is somehow, co-opted by the Islamic Republic. So both sides are kind of invested in this. So no, I would say like he's basically being used as a kind of as like a scarecrow of kind of in order to kind of gin up like again discontent. Um, and kind of galvanize that potentially around this figure. But obviously, I mean, as you saw with Trump's and I mean, even like Lindsey Graham, who's like, one of the biggest warmongers in the United States, and absolutely kind of, cleaves to the Israeli line on these things. Even he said publicly at the Munich Security Conference that yeah, we don't back kind of Reza Pahlavi. So I mean, I don't think like anyone, the cynical power politics kind of these the real people, the people in the smoke filled rooms who are making these like decisions like in the Pentagon or like in the CIA. I don't think they really take him seriously because he's been like lobbying them since the revolution for backing, right? And they basically have pretty much like dismissed him as like a not serious figure. He sees this as his great opportunity, and I think like the key thing here is obviously the Israelis pushing him has been the decisive thing with the Trump administration, right? That's what's really kind of been set a different tone. Even though Trump has not like kind of dismissed him, but the fact that he's really had so much more profile is because the Israelis have a clearly like thought out concerted strategy of like pushing him as much as kind of possible. And I don't know if you saw his one of his statements. He sort of said like one of the things that he prefaced when obviously he takes power in Iran will immediately normalize with Israel. That was like one of the first things that he sort of said. So no, he's absolutely like I think I wouldn't even be surprised if a lot of his strategy is now basically coming right out of Tel Aviv. I think he's basically controlled. And I don't know if you saw there was even a picture of him with Miriam Adelson like at the Munich
Yeah,
Security Conference, like right.
yeah.
So I think he's absolutely kind of like pretty much the Israeli kind of candidate, and they're pushing him as much as possible. But yeah, I mean, even if there is support and increased support from inside Iran, the idea that he has any chance of yeah getting anywhere near power is yeah for the medium term to the long term is I think pretty
Maybe he has
bad.
some kind of an award he could give to Trump ahead of time.
Yeah, maybe. I don't think Trump would want that one. But another thing, there's kind of it I should add. He's been sort of claiming for like decades now that he has like 50,000 people in the military who are ready to kind of, swear fealty to him. And it's never materialized. It's never ever like it's absolutely not like worth anything. And he's a braggart and he's like, he just basically is obviously trying to flog his kind of wares and see who will take them up, really. And the minute the Israelis are certainly biting for sure.
I mean, what strikes me about him is, I mean, this has been almost close. We're going on 50 years that regime's been gone, right? And he's
Yeah,
kind of reappearing. Like I said, I know he's still alive. It's interesting though, because I think this kind of ties in Israel's support of Pahlavi ties into what Huckabee just said, right? Which was a statement that even Trump's people are kind of running away from, where he's basically said, Israel has a right to the entire region. How did that play inside Tehran, inside Iran?
oh, right. Well, I mean, I think they I'm sure I mean, they amplify it, but I think they don't see it necessarily as impacting them. I think they probably will communicate more to like the Gulf states and yeah, states like Turkey, who with which they obviously have relations, um, Saudi Arabia perhaps even. But I guess I think they really want to. I mean, Iran is, and you saw this with Araghchi, the foreign minister, when he was recently in Doha. He was obviously, they are obviously committed to painting Israel as the source of instability in the region, and they're very much like trying to convince Arab states and Turkey that actually that this is the case. And obviously, I think we know that's the case, but obviously, historically, I mean, there has been like severe like distrust, and actually there was kind of bandwagoning on the part of like the Arab Gulf states towards like obviously with the US obviously, but like with the Israelis as well against Iran to try and actually contain Iran. And that was kind of really since I guess the Iraq War, that was the kind of the way things were playing out. I mean, you had increase, and this obviously then culminated in the Abraham Accords, and then this obviously before October 7th this was meant to kind of culminate in like a detente or normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And obviously, the genocide in Gaza and all that has kind of obviously, very much disrupted all of that for the foreseeable kind of future, it seems. But now there's sort of this idea of greater Israel. I mean, what obviously the Israelis did in Syria following the fall of Assad, basically completely demilitarizing that state and then, taking Mount Hermon and and basically de facto trying to annex more territory, plus what's going on in the West Bank, and then and all of the all of the violence which has been unleashed there. I think yeah, there is obviously fears amongst sort of the Arab states and Turkey more now that Israel is sort of an unchecked Israel is really the chief or primary thing that they need to worry about. I guess the question is though is like okay, they might know this, but are they willing to break with the United States in any which way in order to do something about it? And I think like no, I mean they'll make a phone call to Trump and they'll probably make their case, and they might try to offer him some sort of inducements. But I think they all understand like. Particularly the Gulf. I mean, it's very close. I mean, like, Iran could send a couple of ballistic missiles and like, it's like Dubai's going to be in trouble. I mean, it could like destroy just decades of building up their tourist industry and all these sorts of things. So I think they understand how destabilizing this could be. And even the UAE, which is obviously a very close ally of Israel. Um, I mean, Lindsey Graham sort of said that, MBZ, pretty much Mohammed bin Zayed, did everything that was asked of him and more, and working hand in glove with the Israelis. But they came out very strongly and said, um, "Oh, no attacks will be launched from here. We will have no sort of part in this sort of thing," because they understand like how detrimental it will be. But they're not able to. I don't think they're ultimately. I mean, you know this better than me. I mean, they're unable to persuade the American sort of, I mean, sort of national, sort of the military industrial complex or with the American administration to not to not sort of proceed and not sort of take this forward. And obviously the Israelis have a lot more sort of power of persuasion than the Gulf states very kind of clearly. I mean, as is clear from, obviously how things have transpired and obviously, um, the fact that they're even now kind of complicit in many ways in the Gaza genocide and the fact that they're being brought into this farcical board of peace and etc. So really, like what leverage do they have to kind of apply to the Trump administration to persuade them from doing this, let alone, I mean, and again, they probably think that their relationship with Trump and, the Qataris buying him this, gifting him this $300 million plane and all the rest of it, it somehow buys them immunity. I mean, I guess they'll understand sooner or later that it really doesn't, which I guess, to be fair, when the Israelis did attack Qatar, actually, this did actually create some friction, right? And then, like, Trump lent on sort of Netanyahu to basically apologize, but I think that's as far as it goes. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the regional context of this because again, to kind of go back to Cuba, Cuba has no allies because it's small, right? And there's really no to do that. Iran's different. Iran is a big country. It has oil, has an army. And granted, the U.S. has, this kind of really overbearing force in the region. But one thing I've read recently, and this may just be bluffing, is that, Iranians have said we may attack kind of these peripheral targets or these proxy targets. You know, is that a consideration? I mean, does one a couple of years ago, you and our good friend Nate were on talking about the axis of resistance, right? Which,
Yeah, yeah.
but is there a possibility that if the United States does try to kind of turn this into a war, that there will be some, kind of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, like Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, he did say very clearly this time that if they attack Iran, then they will kind of regionalize the
Yeah,
conflict,
yeah.
basically. And I think this probably, I mean, whether they will or not, I'm not entirely sure. But I do think if they've learned the kind of the lessons since October 7th, then they kind of should have understood that the kind of tit for tat kind of approach, this sort of, Israel strikes the consulate in Damascus, then Iran sort of launches a choreographed kind of and signaled in advance
Yeah.
kind of attack in which then can be repelled. And then similarly, I mean, we obviously following the assassination and bombing and killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, then again they did a bolder attack, but still it was all very much about trying to restore deterrence rather than, I guess, you know, trying to regionalize the conflict to create to raise the ante because I think they were concerned, they were worried about raising the ante to such a degree that that would actually then necessitate a far more kind of aggressive sort of posture on behalf of the US. But I guess they've seen that hasn't really paid off because obviously it's only really just kind of emboldened the US, like really, and the Israelis. I mean, it hasn't deterred them. And the Israelis obviously are, they know that they pretty much got like unqualified backing by the United States, but it hasn't
Sure.
obviously, it hasn't it hasn't really, checked the United States. It hasn't slowed or halted ongoing kind of aggression. And if anything, I think, whereas they kind of might look to the strategy pursued by the Houthis, whereby, the Trump administration did throw a lot at them, but then they actually retaliated very, very forcefully. And then the cost and all these sorts of things just, they determined that it was no longer worth pursuing, and they reached a kind of modus vivendi with the Ansar Allah in Yemen. And maybe Iran is thinking something similar that, this time they will really have to respond in a much more kind of costly way, whether that's mining and, the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's striking far more forcefully at US air bases and actually even inflicting US casualties. So it is costly for Trump. Um, I mean, they're probably weighing up again multiple, just like the Trump administration is weighing up multiple kind of scenarios or multiple things that they could do. They could do a more measured strike or an all-out one or pursue like regime change. Iran is definitely probably like weighing up if they do a sort of more calibrated versus a far more kind of, like encompassing and broad ranging kind of attack, which really kind of will create a huge amount of instability, like regionally in the Persian Gulf region. Yeah.
I mean, I think at this point, something's inevitable,
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
sooner rather than later. Inside Iran, and I'm assuming you read the media. What are they expecting? Are they expecting kind of limited strikes? Are they expecting something big? Is there any sense of like what they think the next step is?
I mean, I think they are expecting like war. Yeah.
Hmm.
They're pretty convinced. I mean, they're
More
like,
than last June?
yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think they're expecting a much more serious like attack. And I mean, from what I understand, like Ayatollah Khamenei has also like appointed like successors, like multiple down the chain. He's appointed also people to take over the sort of command and control in all the different sort of areas of the military and air force and navy and so on as well. So I think they're pretty much expecting for something along the lines of again like much more widespread decapitation effort actually, and they're prepared for that. So whether that actually happens, we have to see. But like I think they are prepared for that, and they think that's a very likely like possibility. And I think they are committed. I mean, at least the current leadership. Obviously, if Khamenei dies, then things could change quite significantly. But I think the leadership as it stands is prepared to inflict a serious cost this time on like the US and those who are seen as complicit in this attack. And like I said, because they just see that the previous attempts at calibrated response has just not actually worked. If anything, it's emboldened the US and Israel.
Well, inside the US, which is something I've always looked at fairly closely, we're in this situation where there's real bipartisanship here. Like, right, the Democrats aren't saying anything because they're all in on it. I mean, Hillary Clinton was, and Biden was, and Kamala Harris was. And whatever reservations you're seeing actually are coming from the military, right? Even like Kane, Raising Kane, Dan Kane,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
chair
yeah,
of the Joint,
yeah,
who's nuts. He's nuts. But even he said, like, we can strike them, but doing more than that is probably not feasible. And Trump has said, oh no, he doesn't believe that at all.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
you're in this weird situation where, kind of in a lot of ways, the only I'm not going to call him moderate, but the only kind of force for less than total destruction is like the U.S. military inside the
yeah,
U.S.
yeah. But I
And
think you've got like
clearly
real
that
danger. So no,
no,
sorry, I was
but
just going to say, like, what you think? There's like the real danger of groupthink. I think like really taking hold. Like I guess particularly following the kidnapping of Maduro in
yeah,
Venezuela, and then thinking that Iran is somehow like analogous to that, and this can kind
right,
of be
right.
transferred, and like riding off that hubris. And I even like there's no sort of, from what I understand, there's like not even like a nuclear like expert in like the room, like kind of discussing like what it all means even. They don't even have the expertise. It's pretty much just, I guess, these rather like loyalist
Yeah,
appointees,
yeah.
right? And
Well,
people who are
Trump
idle.
fires like in the Caribbean, he's fired every commander who's, questioned in any way, what they're doing in
Yeah,
Venezuela. He'll just
yeah.
fire people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's like I mean, so this is why I think, yeah, I don't think it's going to be the most expensive bluff in history, right? I think, like, I mean, again, I'm not a military expert from what I understand, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but moving this much kind of firepower, I mean, it's costing like billions of dollars,
Oh
right?
God, yes. Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like something at this point kind of does need to happen. It's just this, it's the extent, it's the scale of it, right? It's the
Yeah.
scale of the attack at this point. So
Well,
I don't think this.
last summer they used, I think, more than half of the bunker busters they had, which was an expenditure of hundreds of, close to $1 billion, I believe. And that's like,
Yeah,
but the
well,
U.S.
yeah.
the U.S. media is cheerleading this as well, right? You
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah,
Brett Stevens in the New York Times, and
yeah,
so I mean, this is kind of, essentially the Zionists are just, changing Hamas to Iran,
yeah, yeah. I guess the thing is like I mean, I do see by I guess more level-headed, let's say, talking heads or those who are kind of also adjacent to like I don't know the State Department or the American National Security State. They are some people are saying this is like a war of choice, right? And they're kind of saying that this is like Trump, I mean, like, why are we even doing this? Because, the American public isn't overwhelmingly, basically behind this in any
Oh, not at all.
way.
They're not even
Yeah.
close. Like
So
two
there was no
thirds or
terrorist attack.
more. Yeah,
Yeah, there's no terrorist attack.
yeah.
There's not even any risk of Iranian nuclear breakout because, obviously, like we said at the beginning, Trump said he obliterated the nuclear program. And even then, when they attacked the three nuclear sites in Iran, it was very clear, like Netanyahu in cabinet meetings saying that, Iran is years away. And obviously, this has been this ongoing thing for decades now. That Iran is, 6 months away, a year away from nuclear
Well, who was
breakout.
it the other day? It wasn't Besson. Somebody said Iran is rebuilt 60% of its nuclear capacity, and like it's a week away or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
they
yeah. No,
say this, and you should be laughed at. I mean, it's so preposterous, and yet, no,
uh,
but to get to your point, like I've been thinking that myself. Like, what's the motive for this? Like, like we said before, we gotta like you can get what you want far short of this. Like, you can always get what you want, all right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, they're not. I honestly don't think they're interested in a nuclear agreement at all.
Oh,
Because
no, no, no.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
don't
of
think
course,
that.
it was hilarious because they floated for a while that like they're there to protect human rights because of the protests, right? And then they're killing people in Minnesota, so that didn't work very
Yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
well either.
No, no, no. Of course. Like, I mean, like again, I mean, it's very transparent. I mean, even before the Operation Midnight Hammer, you had Tulsi Gabbard who came out with the national security kind of sort of intelligence estimate and was sort of saying that no decision towards weaponization has been made, and this is obviously goes back to 2007 national intelligence estimate, and this is like kind of well established, you know. But then it was immediately reversed, like, right? And then she's been pushed, to the margins really ever since then. She's been like really kind of marginalized and I guess trying to get back into Trump's good graces. Um, but yeah, I mean, then and obviously then they carried out the Operation Midnight Hammer, claimed that it was obliterated. And Iran is even in talks with obviously the IAEA, despite the fact that there's been a lot of speculation whether it was actually compromised and whether they leaked things. In Iran actually alleged that they leaked the names of scientists to the Israelis and Western intelligence. And again, we don't know whether this is true or not, but this was the allegation. So yeah, there's no even any pretense that this is about a kind of an imminent threat or 45 minutes famously in the UK this dodgy dossier and claiming that Saddam could strike Europe within with 45 minutes prior warning, which is obviously all kind of fabricated stuff. So there's not even any pretense anymore, which I think is obviously the new way in which sort of US empire is operating today. I mean, there's not any even need to kind of dress it up in the language of like kind of liberalism, or sort of the international sort of rules-based order, and all of that has been pretty much shunted aside. So no, it's difficult to deem exactly why this is happening. I guess I'm sure like the Israeli factor and probably his donor base and people like Miriam Adelson and Larry Ellison and various others probably are, very much important in pushing this. I mean, his consumption of Fox News, I know he just sort of was sharing this segment by Mark Levine about like you have to basically pursue um, regime change. I mean, the thing with Trump, which is always curious, like, I mean, I recall his comments regarding John Bolton, and he was like, which I don't know if you remember, he was sort of saying,
Yeah,
oh, this guy's really nuts. So he's just like
yeah,
wants war all the time.
yeah.
So I would use him as a way of kind of, scaring my kind of opponent. But I do think like when Trump does say it, like when he goes this far, usually he kind of does tend to follow through. Um, uh, and again, I think so much momentum has been built up at this point that he's going to follow through. And the question then is like, how does Iran respond? And if Iran responds very, very forcefully, will that cause him to back down, or will that cause him to double down? I mean, and on that, I'm still. I mean, I don't know if you have any insight. I'm really unsure on what path he would take there on that. So, because it could cause him to kind of, back down up to a point and say, I mean, but again, if a lot of American personnel were injured or killed, I mean, then that again could create like impetus, and then he could rally, sort of nationalist fervor maybe around that potentially. I mean, we would have to see.
Well, it's funny. Kane actually, that was one of his points. A lot of Americans could be killed. It's funny you mentioned Bolton because after that, Trump said, "All Bolton wants to do is kill people. Like, he doesn't care about human life. He just wants to kill people, right?"
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah,
you know, I
yeah.
saw a headline the other day, and unfortunately I didn't pursue it. Did Starmer like refuse base rights or something like that, or refueling or something? Or there was something about.
I think they were quite apprehensive about because they didn't, but I think they did actually take, if I'm not mistaken, like is it F-15s? I might be wrong with that, but like they basically had flown them out from US bases in the UK to basically where they were closer to Iran, and also Trump wants to use Diego Garcia as a
Right,
potential
right, right.
like launching pad like they did with these like they did with in Operation Midnight Hunt. Well, they actually didn't actually they did it from the United States, but he wants the
Right.
option of Diego Garcia as well to be
Yeah.
used. I think the British government doesn't really want to be dragged into it as well. So he was
This is
trolling
this is
Obama.
really off topic in a sense, but um, the British are taking like the Epstein stuff way more seriously, right? Is that affecting the relationship with Israel at all? Because that's kind of one of the untold stories of this. In the U.S.,
Yeah.
we keep hearing that Epstein was a Russian agent, which I'm not sure, but obviously he was way closer to Israel than anyone else. And the British do seem to be taking that way more seriously.
Yeah, I don't think the Israeli factor is really
Israel,
being,
okay, I'm just
yeah, really.
curious.
No, no, it's more the main thing which is really created a lot of controversy is obviously like I guess Andrew Windsor Mountbatten, where
Yeah,
his name is. Obviously that the royal family being directly kind of implicated, but also Peter Mandelson, who obviously was
right,
appointed
right,
by Starmer, who was kind of like a kind of key figure in like New Labour and the Blair Project and so on,
right,
right? And then remained a kind of really important Labour grandee. And he was also like a very important person who was, supporting the Labour right, the right of the Labour Party to neutralise Corbyn and sort of the Corbyn like
right,
insurgency within the Labour Party. But the main thing, which is, he was arrested and detained, was because he was basically, he was basically giving government like secrets and like almost like things related to insider trading, right? Like
right,
actually leaking
right.
information about potential bailouts and the fact that the Prime Minister Gordon Brown was about to resign and feeding this to Epstein. So it's more on his abuse. I mean, who knows if it will hold at all? But it's more on his abuse of public office.
Yeah,
Basically, that's the thing which
yeah.
is
It
causing
just
problems.
came to me because there are kind of elements in the U.S., generally more leftish, who are trying to kind of make this about Israel as well. And I just wondered if there
Yeah,
was
yeah.
something like that. Is couple more things. I really appreciate this as always. It's
No,
great
no, no,
talking to
no,
you.
no, no.
Is there kind of a mobilization going on inside Iran right now? A preparation,
Militarily, you mean? Like,
militarily and like the population? Are they kind of like preparing people, like shelters? Is the military mobilizing? Yeah. Is there just kind of
yeah,
a
no, I mean,
national? Is there a national mobilization of some sort going on?
I wouldn't say there's a national mobilization. I'd say the government is obviously preparing and has been doing like drills in the Persian Gulf. And there was recently in the FT leaks of this Iranian sort of buying kind of. again, it won't really make an impact, I think, with respect to an Israeli Russian attack. But buying like sort of various kind of military kit from the Russians and various deals on that sort. So I think there have been drills as preparation. There's been efforts to like rebuild the air defense systems, things like this. There's been a fair bit. And I guess rallying amongst those people who are in the Revolutionary Guard, who are in the Basij, and the wider military. So there has been some of this, and there has been significant kind of preparation. But actually, yeah, I don't think more nationally, I don't think there
Yeah.
has been. I mean, people are preparing insofar as maybe they're buying like staples and like
Yeah.
and vital kind of sort of equipment and things they'll need if if the electricity goes out, if water and things like this. People are preparing, but yeah, I mean, one of the things that characterized the June War, I mean, it was a surprise attack. So I hope they were criticized for actually a lack of really having plans in place. Actually, there's a lot of kind of criticism about this. And lots of people were just told to kind of, go to the subway. I was sort of, as I was telling you earlier. But this time around, yeah, I mean, I would hope so, but I haven't actually seen much evidence that they're
Yeah.
actually preparing amongst the wider kind of population for a coming kind of war. I think also they probably don't want to spark panic as well.
Yeah.
That's probably
Yeah.
another thing which they kind of they want to sort of keep a lid on it up to a point as best they can.
Finally, last thing, we don't expect the other Gulf states to actually oppose the U.S., but if something does happen and it does expand, is it conceivable that the Gulf states might step in to try to negotiate an end to it to say, okay, because if this spills out, who knows? There are kind of, I don't know, is it possible that like the so-called Arab Street would kind of rise up against these other states? I mean, there's a lot going on there. Is it conceivable that these other Arab states who aren't necessarily close to Iran would step in and say, okay, enough?
Yeah, I mean, so Oman and Qatar have been always very quite, and Turkey actually
Yeah,
recently have been very kind of proactive in trying to like de-escalate
yeah,
and avoid this because they understand it's going to be like bad for the region
yeah,
as a whole. It's going to be massively destabilizing. Obviously, Iran shares a border with Turkey. This could lead to a massive like outflux of people. Yeah, and again, that's going to be, and they've already sort of absorbed people from Syria and things like this, and it's extremely destabilizing. And obviously, it's very costly and sort of has a high cost. Like internally in a place like Turkey, and then again, like small states like Qatar and the UAE, obviously, yeah, they understand it's going to be really, bad for
yeah,
them economically potentially, and it could have really kind of serious repercussions. Which also because they count on like stability, and obviously they
sure,
rely on a lot of like
exactly.
Western direct investment and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think they wouldn't really be able to do much more than actually just lobby and try to actually, call the Trump administration and really try and insist that this is having a devastating cost. I guess the question is like, is whether, I mean, the reason why Trump is moving this huge amount of firepower is because I guess he's been told that, or he's being maybe told by those around him that we can potentially contain any sort of counterstrike from Iran if we have this amount of firepower. And I think actually a lot of this thing of stringing out the negotiations was about buying time, just like it was in prior to the June war. A lot of this is buying time to sort of get as much kind of all the forces they need in the region. And then maybe he's been given assurances that yeah, and by those who are willing to kind of feed him what he wants to hear, that this would suffice potentially. And then maybe he's giving these assurances to the regions. I know we will be able to defend you and we'll be able to insulate you from the cost of this. And yeah, I mean, in the best of times, lots of things go wrong in military like maneuvers and military operations of this sort, right? Let alone on a kind of a state like Iran where it's really, it's unknown and like, they could potentially, I mean, Iran could be really overwhelmed. I mean, this amount of firepower that the United States commands is really it's unparalleled in history in the history of humanity really, whereas Iran has developed impressive asymmetric capabilities, but it's like a middle power with like that's been under sanctions for decades, and like you said, doesn't have, it's not like the Warsaw Pact or something. It doesn't have like
Yeah,
allies and or a major superpower which is has a nuclear weapon that can ultimately, back it. I mean, it doesn't. It's, which is part itself a legacy of the revolution itself, that it wanted to kind of be independent and wanted to strike out this. The whole approach was neither east nor west. Um, so it is quite isolated. But yeah, like I said, these Gulf states and Turkey, at best, they will be lobbying Trump to try and bring it to contain it and
Right,
and
right,
bring it to
right,
an end sooner rather than later. They're not going to be. It's very unlikely that they're going to be. They have any leverage whatsoever to sort of either stop this or ask him to stop it earlier if he feels that it's basically doing what he wants it to do. I mean, you see this with him a lot actually. When he sees like an opponent weak, he really does try to push it to the extreme. So if you remember, like even in the recent protests in Iran, he was saying encouraging people to go and take over the institutions, right? Like so, and I'm sure if like that wasn't put down by the state in a brutal way, he would have continued to encourage it, and then he may be been emboldened even further, and so on. So it's really as far. I mean, he's emboldened to the degree to which he can actually get away like with it, and which he doesn't actually have like obstacles directly in his way. That's the thing. So that's why I think the Iranians have decided that we have to basically throw everything, or as much as we can, really reasonably, because we have to really kind of just like put a line in the sand at this point.
well, maybe it'll be delayed a few days because I don't know if you saw the news. The Gerald Ford sewage system broke down today.
I saw that. Yeah.
And there are stories which haven't been confirmed, probably aren't true, that the soldiers are sabotaging. I'm sorry, the sailors on the ship are sabotaging
Right.
the sewage system because they don't want to be there. You never know. I mean, if you study,
It's like
like
the
I've
newest
studied
one.
military. Hmm?
It's the newest aircraft
Yeah,
carrier,
yeah,
right? Newest and the biggest of the
yeah.
United
I mean, I've
States. Yeah.
studied enough about the military that that's always possibility. I mean, a lot of these guys, so you never know. But well, let's hope for the best. I hope you and the people in Iran are doing well. I can't imagine the
Yeah.
stress, but it's always great talking with you about this stuff.
Oh, pleasure.
I really appreciate it because so much, like I said, so much of what I read, and I know enough about it to kind of spot the bullshit and spot who knows what's going on. And so it's really great. And I know that I'm sure you're going to catch some hell because you didn't offer a full-throated defense of the Iranian government and so on.
They don't
So
make it easy.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, they
But
make it easy to. But no. Again, thanks for having me on, Bob. It's always
oh, no, no, no.
always
Anytime,
great to speak. Really.
I
Yeah,
really appreciate it, and thanks
yeah,
so much. And um, oh, I forgot to mention at the start too. You wrote a new introduction for Fred Halliday's book, right? Oh,
yeah.
fantastic.
Dictatorship and Development. Yeah, we
Yeah,
issued a new edition. So
yeah,
with like extended as well, his writings after the revolution. But
yeah.
yeah, I thought that book, Dictatorship and Development onto the Pahlavi era, got a lot of yeah, it got a lot of bad like it wasn't treated fairly, I think, in a lot of the historiography, and it sort of remains one of the like still like very good kind of I would say Marxist accounts of the Iranian state in the Pahlavi era.
I
So
mean, I don't know that topic that well. I read it in grad school and so forth, but Halliday's book was always like kind of important to me. So that's
yeah,
really great to bring in a lot of these old folks who've been just kind of credit or ignored. I think more than discredited are really
yeah,
vital. I mean, like
yeah.
when I taught, like I had people reading stuff that probably people I've been reading in 25, 30. I actually had Halliday's book on my reading list and
Okay,
figured
okay.
like old people like that, so
Yeah.
that's
Well,
really
you're
cool
one of the
too.
few because there's in the contemporary scholarship, there's like been this. I mean, we were talking a lot about Pahlavi and then how, in a sense, he's all of a sudden found some support and he's being backed by the Israelis and all these sorts of things. But there has also in the scholarly literature, there's been a kind of like Pahlavi revisionism. I mean, there's even people who are trying to talk about like Pahlavi studies. I mean, and all these sorts of things. So there's so I like that book was important for me. Like also as an undergrad, I remember reading it and I remember like really enjoying it. But then I remember sort of like thinking about it more and more as I saw this like quite like problematic trend in a lot of the writing, a lot of the historical work that was being done on the 70s, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
fantastic. No, it's great, and you're the go-to guy for this stuff, so I really appreciate it. So,
No, no, no. Pleasure, Bob. No, always good. Always
um,
good.
this is Bob Bazingo going solo today in the Green and Red podcast with Eskandar Sadeghi. If you want to know anything about what's going on in Iran, check him out. Check out his writings. Like I said, most recently in the London Review of Books and New Left Review, a lot of podcasting.